These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Move with the rhythms, get down.
From WSNC 90.5, a broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University, this is Africa World Now Project, and I'm your host, James Pope. Amilcar Cabral, one of the African world's foremost intellectual theoreticians, is also one of the most neglected in the study of the African world. If we were to try to encapsulate Amilcar Cabral's influence into a single phrase, it would have to be his insistence on the study of reality. He insisted that one does not confuse the reality you live in with the ideas you have in your head. He would frequently elaborate on this by suggesting your ideas may be good, even excellent, but they will be useless ideas unless they spring from and interweave with the reality you live in. What is necessary is to see beyond and into appearances, to free yourself from the sticky grasp of received opinions, whether academic or otherwise. Only through a principled study of reality, of the strictly here and now, can a theory of revolutionary change be integrated with its practice to the point where the two can become inseparable. For Amilcar Cabral, it is always necessary to tell no lies and claim no easy victories. Today, Africa World Now Project will bring to you a community-based discussion on the impact and the implications of the praxis of Amilcar Cabral. We bring this organic form, which was based on a screening of a film titled Cabralista. This film was developed with the expressed purpose to be made publicly accessible via the internet to all that want to know about Amilcar Cabral. Cabralista is an ambitious documentary trilogy chronologically divided into past, present, and future. Part 1, Past, is a visual biography of Amilcar Cabral based on historical facts and testimonies of his lifetime collected throughout the years and narrated by Val Lopez, the director and author of the trilogy. Part 2, Present, Collective Memory, which explores the present, how Amilcar Cabral is remembered, defining a non-formal zeitgeist around his ideology, showing an African youth with strong Cabralist views. Part 3, Future, Utopia, is a futuristic view of a better Africa in a world where the early African freedom fighters have not been eliminated and Africa's development has not been disturbed or distorted, but left to its own hands to grow freely. In today's program, we will listen to the discussion after part 1 of this trilogy was screened. James Early, former Director of Cultural Studies and Communication at the Center for Folklife Programs and Cultural Studies at the Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C., and member of the board of the Institute for Policy Studies, myself, and the audience engaged in a non-traditional organic discussion that explored the legacy and impact of the praxis of Amilcar Cabral. Enjoy the program.
Yeah, listen. When Ugandans and Kenyans and Tanzanians, my Gambians and Zambians, my Ghanaians, my Nigerians, Algerians, Liberians, American Africans, Afro-Americans, Sudanese, Lebanese, and Senegalese, all my Rwandese, Congolese, and Beninese, Bisu, Equatorial and New Guinean, Libyan, Ivorian, and Tunisian, all my North and East and all my South Africans, all my West and my Central Africans, all my Swazi, my Malagasy, my Burkina.
And if you have been with us at many of the events that we have done, you know that we like to have the events to be very, very organic and very, very interactive. So with that said is that when we start the conversation, we do not mind raising your hand and also being able to engage with this multi-leveled and very, very complex person, but also to deal with some of these particular some of the concepts and some of the ideas within the context of right now, given a lot of the violence that is happening in the African world, and also how these things have a root in certain ideas that seems to be old, but they're actually they seem to be new, but they're actually very old ideas: colonialism, imperialism, neocolonialism. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to start out by throwing a very complex, let me get my notes here, a very complex question, but maybe not so complex with Mr. Early here, to kind of get us to going. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the conversation with Mr. Early, but I also want you guys to engage with this particular conversation as well. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to fade out talking because I don't like to hear myself talk a lot. So I teach, but I don't lecture. So I like to have my students do most of the talking, and I just basically guide. Okay, everybody clear? All right. So one of the things that I found in my own work, and also not only academia but also within the context of community work, is that when this question came to mind when I was just sitting there, and why is it that Cabral simultaneously is an important part of African and diasporic struggles, yet also missing from most discourses on ideas about the freedom struggle within the context of the Black African world?
Thank you very much. Let me do just a little brief context and then respond to your question. First, I just want to give a short quote from Cabral, because there really is no substitute for engaging Cabral other than going to his actual writings. This film is done for contemporary reasons and has some very important elements, but I was thinking, my reading of Cabral leads me to feel he probably would wince talking about being a cabralistas. Marx never said he was a Marxist. In fact, he says, I never said I was a Marxist. I dealt with historical and dialectical materialism, a way of understanding the world. Here's Cabral. I am a simple African man doing my duty in my country in the context of my time. I am a simple African man doing my duty in my country in the context of my time. Now, he was a little more than a simple man. He was an educated man. He came from an educated family. He was a poet. He was recruited by one of the most renowned professional soccer teams in Portugal. He went off to study agronomy, the land and crop development, because the environment in which he lived was one that suffered drought. His words, my people, the majority of my people, live with the lack of an ability to read or write, and I'm in the bush hardly with clothes on. They have limited technology. He understood his environment and he immersed himself in the context of his time. I think that's the important thing to take a look at about Cabral, rather than to try to get into let's write up another set of rules and regulations that will run for the next 1,000 years because Cabral said, Malcolm said, Sojourner said. Live in the context of our time is what he was all about. Immerse yourselves in the reality of your time. When you read him, you will hear such terms. It is really a great loss that Cabral is not better known in the context of his time and how he looked at the world and how he moved to organize himself with the people around him to take on Portuguese colonialism. That has to do a lot with the issue of racism, of looking away from the great thinkers and activists of the time, looking to Europe. The Cubans, for example, just before the fall of the Soviet Union, began a critique of why did they take a European context and try to set it down in a tropical nation. One of the leading Marxists there, a black man, saying, I don't believe in Christianity. I'm not into religion, but why would we say that religion is the opiate of the people when the majority of people in Cuba are using these African religions for the uplift of their souls? They have never tried to take state power, as does the Vatican. So racism has a lot to do with that. Black Africa, using that in the negative, blocking out Africa as any point of civilization, of any point of enlightenment. We have been socialized not only as black people, but we have been socialized particularly in the West and outside of Africa, as well as inside of Africa. It is Howard University that trains the first African historians from Africa. They're not trained on the continent of Africa. It is Joseph Harris, who is still living, right here in Washington, D.C., the father of African diaspora studies. He does not like that term, but he trained the first African historians. So these are the historical contexts that Cabral says to us, return to the source, re-Africanize. Now, he is not talking about going back 2 or 3 millennia or even 100 years or 50 years. He is saying, look at the context in which Africans live. Africans plural, not one African, 30 ethnic groups in Guinea, not to mention others in Cape Verde. I've been to Cape Verde in 1993, 92, somewhere in there. I went to Cape Verde in my work at the Smithsonian Institution. How many of you know the name Ray Almeida? Anybody here know the name Ray Almeida? Well, Ray Almeida was a very important African living here in the United States, working on humanitarian issues around the world with religious groups, but very closely connected to his home country of Cape Verde. And I took a group of people there at that time, and I asked to see Ana Cabral, the last wife of Amilcar Cabral. So go online and look at Ana Cabral's article written in 1995 when she talks about culture and national liberation implications for nation states today. Now, we took them into the Smithsonian Institution. This is not a story about me or about Ray Almeida, but it is really a story about busboys and poets, about Sankofa, public space institution where we have to bring radical ideas, systemic thinking that attempts to transform entire systems, not just on the outskirts. So that would be my introductory comment to your...
It's a mouthful, right? Yes. David?
The problem of finding works by Cabral in English, I don't know of many. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Well, you can go online and find plenty of work by Amilcar Cabral, and you will find a more recent compilation that was published last year by Bill Fletcher and from the former editor of Pamazuka. Feroz Manji, where a number of people from my generation, I'm 68 years old, who were influenced by Cabral, by the reading of Cabral and our own activism, not as intellectuals, but we were intellectuals in the sense of Cabral. Cabral says, you must study everything. You must look at reality. You must examine everything in its concreteness. That's intellect. Everybody has an intellect. Intellectuals don't come out of universities. Intellect means making sense. Capital I intellectuals do that in the university. Cabral was very clear of the intellect of everyday people. So look at that work by that edition by Bill Fletcher and Feroz, and you will find, but just go online, Google Amilcar Cabral, and you will find lots and lots of stuff to read. But here's another indication, particularly for the young adults, young activists in the room, young would-be scholars in the room. Study another language. Cabral not only mastered Portuguese, but he mastered the engagement of the codes, whether it was language, whether it was the dance forms. Funana, just an extraordinary rhythmic movement that in the West we call sensuous and over-sexual. But these are children who are trained to follow their imagination and to objectify life processes using their body, if you will, as text. It had nothing to do with lewdness. Cabral was very, very clear of looking at this. I've traveled the islands of Cape Verde and gone into some of those distant communities where those cultures are very still rich. That's what Cabral did, because he was studying literally the land in order for people to be able to produce. The issue here about whether he was a Marxist is a very important one. Read him. He says that Lenin was the most important theoretician for the national liberation movement. He did not call himself a Leninist. He was looking at how Lenin analyzed and organized, and he says, do not reject the positive, his term, accretions from the oppressor. If you drink milk, I don't, I would advise you to drink pasteurized milk, not reject it because Pasteur was not black. Cabral will tell you that makes no sense. You are putting yourself in a disease situation. As he says throughout here, it is not the skin color that he's looking at. But he's saying use the worldview and the organized lives of everyday people as a way to engage the world, not to reject it, and to select those things through your cultural frames. One other point, and then I'll stop so we can open up again. Culture here was mostly presented from the framework of artistic expression, dance, music. That's not what Cabral meant by culture. He certainly meant that that was a fundamental element of culture. But read the essay by Cabral, History as a Weapon. He says culture is like the fruit of the flower. The flower grows, people engage, they grow, and what is left over, what they achieve, what they determine to be most important, is their history. So he was looking at it both in ways of knowing and doing, as well as in aesthetic expressions. This film, again, would suggest that it's mostly about the artistic performance. As important as that is, he was looking at that as one part of historical expression, not separating the arts out of culture as we do in the West. Art making is sense making, and it falls in the context of intellect making. It's a subset, but it is so powerful that it attracts you to look at it as an independent.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your
I wish you'd stop calling me Mr. and Sir.
Professor. I don't know.
Thank you.
I'm curious to hear what you think the legacy is of Amilcar Cabral on the Lusophone African youth of the day, apart from what was highlighted in terms of dance and music and sort of some of the more literal translations of what it is to be politicized as a youth. What is the legacy of Cabral, not just in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verdean terms, but in the wider Luso-Portuguese speaking post-colonial sort of environments?
This is a speculative response on my part. I don't think it's very strong. However, I think it's hopeful. This film is one example of the hope of young people doing film and bringing it to contemporary expressions like rap, like hip-hop, to look at the creative expressions of the generation of this epoch. And so that is promising. I was in Angola about a year ago to a conference on Queen Nzinga and Aimé Césaire. And I did a presentation on Aimé Césaire and the implications for the contemporary moment of the struggle against neo-colonialism, privatization, deregulation, lower role of the state in the welfare of the people, and in the context of an active participatory democracy, where democracy is seen as in the old Greek way of the demos, the ordinary people, the kratia, the power of ordinary people, starting with the power of their imagination to organize their lives and engage the way that other people engage their lives. People look down at the floor. I'm trained as a Marxist, not in the academy, but in a social organization, although I read Capital and Marx in the academy and all of that. And I thought I was on some alien planet. Angola, MPLA, Marxist revolutionaries, Luanda, the highest priced city on the planet. I think this film is one indication that some young people are trying to reclaim, trying to find new ways. But I suspect, and it's speculation on my part, that Cabral is as little known among young African youth as it would be here in the U.S. among young African Americans and our young other American youth. So you have a task for those of you who are teachers, those of you who are teaching languages, Portuguese in particular. Cabral would be wonderful to read both as a poet and as a theoretician and as a historian.
And also as an activist.
And certainly as an activist, yeah.
Oh, okay. I think I just got the phone. Yep. I think that means I can talk.
Yes.
Okay. James, I'll call him James.
Good. Another old man in the room. So
yeah, exactly. I'm older than he is, actually. there's a young fellow who's making commentary throughout the film, and some of the stuff he says is really great. One of the things he says is, even our leaders are imprisoned by a system that favors a small group of people. In the advertisement for this event, there was some question about, is there a black left, for example, in this country? And if I can take a minute, as an old man, I can just take a minute, right?
Good.
I was mentored, I'm a law professor. I was mentored by a progressive lawyer whose name was Arthur Kenoy, who's one of the co-founders of the Center for Constitutional Rights with William Kunstler. Arthur had a vision for the left in this country that he called the mass party of the people. Mm-hmm. His argument was that Lenin's model was fine if the leadership of the country is all, you can find them all in the Winter Palace, and that the broad base of the population is very undeveloped. But he said if you're talking about an industrialized, developed country, the vanguard has to be thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. And one of the things that I've been working on pretty much since I was in SNCC, back in the day, is how do you build a structure that can accommodate that many people in a democratic participatory process. I've been working on it, I've been blogging on it, Huffington Post, Harold McDougal, you can find me there. But where do you think, when you talked about being in that place in Angola and folks are talking about the power of people and everybody's looking at the floor, where do we go from here? Right now, the left in this country, black and white, is populated, it lacks class diversity. Most of the left in this country are intellectuals or professionals, and we lack a certain skill set. We lack the skill set of organizers. When the trade union movement was severed from the left during the McCarthy period, we lost our connection with the broad base of the population. We got to get that back. I've said enough. Thank you very much.
A little preamble, and then what I think is a hopeful development in Black Lives Matter. I knew Arthur Kenoy. I went to Cuba with him. Arthur Kenoy was the, principal founder of the Center for Constitutional Rights. He had been expelled from the Communist Party probably, in the late 50s. He was a very people-oriented man. We spent a number of days in the U.S. Congress arguing for the independence of Puerto Rico. And the mass party, I spent a lot of time with him and Ted Gillick, who is still out here talking about the environment. You should read Ted Gillick's stuff. Mass party. Look at Black Lives Matter and the principal criticism that emerged within the black community of a civil rights era. Progressives. Oprah is not some reactionary. She's to be put in the broad spectrum of progressives. Al Sharpton is, for whatever the contradictions, is to be put in the broad spectrum of progressives. And then we do our critiques. And so they came after Black Lives Matter were saying, well, you're headless. It's an acephalous organization. Where are your leaders? What is your agenda? And as we look at the horizontal organization, rather than the vertical organization, now 3 black women, 2 lesbians who describe themselves as Marxists. The other sister, I've only met one of them and met her here in Butts Boys and Port, and we will be sitting down again next month when she comes back. While they were the 3 principal founders, they are not the 3 principal spokespeople. Black Lives Matter is a network of networks under a broad rubric using the common concern of Black Lives Matter and the transversal nature of black life, meaning black life is not a channel over here and then there are economic issues and there are war issues. Everything, as Du Bois pointed out to us in 1953, 50 years after the Soul of Black Folk, when he said, I still believe today as yesterday that the color line is a major question of the 20th century. But I've come to understand that behind that is a motivation that also obscures it, and that is that a minority is willing to live in luxury at the great expense of the majority of people. He loved the term ignorance, living in ignorance and disease and poverty. And in order to protect this relationship, they will go to war inevitably against people of color and use color both as skin color and as cultural differences with the West, and look at where the wars are happening today and think about the theory. He was living in the context of his time, examining it. So I think Black Lives Matter, so whatever its limitations may be, is living in the context of its time, and it is organizing in a horizontal network of network kind of way, not in a vertical way that you will say this because this is the document that we wrote. And that has caused some people to be concerned about comportment, disrespect, as though to be in a battle. While Cabral respected his enemies, he picked up the gun. And I will transition and stop on this so you can open up. One of the things about the liberation movements in Africa, Cabral says we must, in the context of that time, use the gun. But he says, and I'm not going to go to my computer, I wrote down a number of notes because I won't be able to find it rapidly. He was not enamored with picking up the gun. He says, if there would be other ways to do this, I would do it. And he says, remember, we are militant activists. We are not armed militarists. We use the gun situationally in the context of our time. Black Lives Matter disrupts, a positive disruption. It is not a negative disrespect. It is a positive disruption to say that if you're not talking about Black Lives Matter, nothing else matters. Because when you look at the crisis of capitalism in 2008, the ethical crisis of capitalism, the thieves that the Obama administration gave trillions of dollars, and that is not to knock everything about the Obama administration. I want to underscore the administration, not just the individual who is the administrator, the lead. But it is to say the housing bubble affected who the most? People of color. And in the context of people of color, this is something Cabral and his theoretical examination of the context of his time, of our time, of how life is organized. Get to the single black women, get to the single poor white women with children, gay, transgender, etc. There is where Black Lives Matter is the foundation stone. Because this system, and Cabral says, there's a lot about use of the term imperialism and capitalism. Cabral says that people are not interested in terminology. Read his quote. I won't go to it right here. They're not interested in terminology. They're interested in filling their bellies, having a roof over their head, having their children in a safe space, being able to move along. Now, he understood that that was imperialism. And he said socialism is the only thing, not as a theory, but as an organized activity in the case of the Soviet Union and China, is the only thing that is competing against it. He didn't say that that was glory or heaven, but he says looking at the correlation of forces, the actors in the context of your time, you have to make a decision. You can make a decision that I will wait for the correct line to descend and be raped and pillaged, or I will get involved with the correlation of forces that are on the dance floor and figure out what rhythm I want to drive to the music that is being played. So this is a part of reading Cabral's method and so about the mass party and the like. I'm not suggesting that Black Lives Matter is going to turn into the mass party, but I think there is something about, first of all, self-concept. They are all leaders. My 36-year-old son, who loves the news, gets me up to his place and he says, Daddy, listen how articulate these black people in Ferguson and Baltimore are, from the guy on the block who says, yeah, I live outside the law. They are quite articulate, right up to the bus driver, right up to the city council person. This is multivocality using multiple intellectual perspectives around a common cause, and that is in the defense of black people. And then they'll fight about other things. But I don't know that that will get us to the mass party, but I think it is something to look at about a new way of organizing that has really thrown everything here up in the air.
From WSNC 90.5, a broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University, this is Africa World Now Project, and I'm your host, James Pope. We are listening to a discussion between James Early, former Director of Cultural Studies and Communication at the Center for Folklife Programs and Cultural Studies at the Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C., and board member of the Institute for Policy Studies, and the community after a screening of part one of a three-part trilogy titled Cabralista that explores the life, ideas, and impact of Amilcar Cabral. For more on this film, go to cabralista.com. That's spelled CABRALISTA.com. We will now return to the program.
Thank you to the organizers. As a young person who has been engaged with Black Lives Matter and as a Cuban solidarity activist, I'm curious if you could speak more on Cabral's internationalism and how internationalism figures into Black Lives Matter and emerging movements now.
Right. Read his speech on from the Tricontinental meeting. I won't remember the exact year, but it is in Havana, Cuba, and he makes theory as a weapon. And the Cubans were like taken aback. Fidel Castro, who has a keen eye and a keen ear, one of the great intellectuals of our time, I wouldn't say one of the great theoreticians of our time, one of the great moralists of our time. That's why every pope says, yeah, I agree with you, the blockade is wrong. He says, no, I'm not going to argue about whether there's a God or not. If that's what you want to do, you do that. But is the blockade wrong? And is it just or unjust to work with people to feed themselves? And the pope says, it is unjust to not feed people. He went into Cuba and he made this speech and he talked about the Cuban Revolution, and he said, Cuba is Africa, because our blood is here, our ethnicity is here. He says, if you need to be replenished, we will send more Africans here who did not. He's looking at that from the historical point of view of slavery. But then in the 1960s, when he makes this speech, he's saying, Cuba is a leader, and he says that we must protect Cuba. He understood that Cuba was living in the context of its time. It was not the Russian Revolution. It was not done it was done by the principles, which theory has one element of principles to it, and the humanistic visions of Jose Marti. It understood that the Haitian Revolution was a sine qua non for Latin American revolution, with Venezuela being the first colony of Spain to defeat Spain in this hemisphere, because Dessalines gave Bolivar boats and men when he went to Haiti to say, that's why it figures so prominently in this moment. So he was a strong internationalist. When he came here in 1972, I guess I don't know whether he was speaking in Massachusetts, I can't recall exactly where. In Syracuse, and Syracuse, New York. He said, the African-American struggle is our struggle. These are black people that are being killed. He understood that both as a racial issue, but he also understood it as an internationalist issue. And I'll stop on this point. Perhaps the most poignant element about his internationalism in the context of his time was the Sino-Soviet ideological and political battle between the Chinese and the Russians of who was going to have the major influence. And of course, the Chinese funded some reactionary black fascists like Savimbi, and we've got people in here who know this much better than I do. But those black Africans in Angola and Mozambique who went around hacking people to death and burning and raping and pillaging were being supported by the Chinese because the Chinese didn't want the Soviets to get a foothold there. It is said, and I have not studied this, but it's something that you will certainly go and take a look at, that Cabral led the most organic and complete revolution of the African revolutions, and he was able to walk a balance between the Chinese and the Soviets, following being an African man doing his duty in the context in which he lived. So he went to the Soviets and he says, he went to the Soviet Union and he says, I need surface-to-air missiles, mobile missiles. And within a week or so, they shot down 5 Portuguese planes. That was the end of the deal. So he was a great internationalist, but he always came from the vantage point, and this is a philosophical, theoretical issue that we can use in our daily lives and in our activist lives. The universal is always in the particular. The universal is in you, in your history, your context. It's not out there to be brought in. That's why he said, accretion, when you see positive developments in another person's history, bring it through your optic, your African framework, your African culture, your Baltimore culture, your Southeast DC culture. So these are the consistent elements of Cabral in a very quiet way, again, not saying that here's a theory that I want you to go out and put my name on.
Yeah, I had a question and a comment. I wondered if you could tell us anything more about the fellow, I think it was, I wrote it down, but not here, Ibn, who apparently developed a theory of surplus value in the 1300s. That was quite interesting.
No, I can't. I'm going to be at your table as soon as I finish because I want to write it down.
Yeah. But I just want to thank you for this. There's been so much new information. I also do feel that I want to make a comment about, in response to the gentleman over there about the Bolsheviks and whether or not they were a mass party. I was part of the Leninist left at the time when Stanley Aronowitz and Arthur Kanoy were developing their work. And with all due credit to them, they had a lot of reasons for opposing Leninism. I think that they were very influenced by the propaganda from the corporate structures about how the Leninists were all undemocratic. And they particularly took exception to what had happened during the Russian Revolution at Kronstadt, where in order to protect a key port city, the Red Army had to move against the people of that city. The conditions of the Civil War were so severe that new layers of workers in that city had come in and were just fed up and blaming the Bolsheviks for the starvation, so they rose up. And if the Bolsheviks had lost that city, they would have lost the revolution. And just one last point, the Bolsheviks were a mass party. In 1917, at the time of the revolution, they had about 8,000 members, and by the time they took state power, they had expanded to 80,000 members. They were only formed because thousands upon thousands of anarchists were killed because they didn't have organization or security in the late 1900s. And the whole idea behind organization is one, security, but the other thing is that if you've got a very well-trained cadre in history and organizational techniques, they can put thousands of more people into activity. So just be very cautious about people like Kanoy and some of these others. Thank you.
I was trying to find Cabral's statement about Lenin, but you can go and find it. And let's go back to Cabral to look at both of these, this exchange, this important and interesting debate. The context of my time. Cabral was saying, no theory is good forever. No truth lasts forever. It's in the context of your time. And what was the most important element that they looked at about Lenin or Leninism? Democratic centralism, which cuts off the democratic voice of the ordinary people, was instituted in a moment of grave circumstances in which they had to act. Today in Cuba, there is an open debate in the Communist Party, led by Raul Castro, saying, what was the first public thing you heard when Raul Castro in 2008 was elected by the National Assembly? He says, there is too little criticism in this country. What is the opposing? Cabral tells us, for every positive, there is a negative. For every step forward, for every victory, you run into new contradictions, new problems, new things that you had not expected, that you don't desire, but you did make progress. Centralism, Leninist centralism. The irony being that Cuba is one of the most educated populations in the world, it gives a larger share of its gross national product than any country in the world to education. And therefore it is one of the leading biotechs and so forth and so on. But it produces almost nothing because centralism and the paternalism of centralism is wait and the vanguard will bring you what you need, rather than a mass party notion, the discourse of 21st century socialism, Hugo Chavez saying socialism in the 21st century must be democratic, that is, you must be elected. And it must be plural. It must come from the context of your time, not from what Lenin said or Martin Luther King said or Arthur Kanoy said or anybody else said. And you have to confront the reality in which you live. And when you read Cabral, he will tell you that every practice produces theory. That does not necessarily tell you the road ahead, but it illuminates from you what you need to test out. So contextualization in the context of our time, rather than these canonical notions from the Bible or from the Quran or I have a dream, because then they didn't say what Martin Luther King said after that. Read his critique of capitalism. You can probably buy the book right in here. All you have to do is look at any book and just go in the back and stick up capitalism, and then read his critique of socialism and read his call for a social democracy. Cabral was about engaging life as it presented itself, trying to understand how you analyze how it's put together. That's the tough thing. And the theory is, if you have looked at history, and history is the context that he gives us, history teaches us certain lessons, but then you have to bring that history to an actual circumstance to see if it is consistent with what has gone on, or whether it's going to be inconsistent, because inconsistencies always emerge. Indeterminate things, that is the expansive nature of the human imagination, that it will always come up with something new, as Black Lives Matter has popped up and hit us with a new organizing context, and we're all sort of frozen of not knowing quite how to relate to these young adult activists. At least far too many of us seem to be frozen.
So, hi, I'm Kristen Cabral, and my question regards climate change and the intersection with Black Lives Matter movement. So his activism seemed to come about from a famine where people died. We had the Dust Bowl in this country, which really got our New Deal under FDR going. And now we have California, which is a breadbasket to the world.
Yes.
And there's no water.
Right. And there's fire.
Yeah. So, and water is life. So, I'm just wondering, I'd love to hear from those who are, younger than myself in the audience, where perhaps, and your feedback as well.
So Cabral, are you related to Cabral?
Not that I know of very closely.
Okay. One of the consistent motifs in Cabral, given the context of his environment, not just the time frame, but his environment, he consistently talks about, and he uses the term man. Man is the dominant element in nature. And he consistently stressed that because he's living in a circumstance in Cape Verde where there is a consistent drought, people dying. The Arabs, going back to probably 6th, 7th, 8th century, would come all the way across the part northern Africa to go to Praia to excavate for salt. Sal, meaning salt in Portuguese, is one of the main islands of the Cape Verdean archipelago. So he was always emphasizing this relationship of this non-capitalist mode of production, a feudal mode of production in which there was a lot of also collective engagement out of necessity, because the environment was so tough to produce food and to live that people could not afford to break off as individuals into little private enterprises. So collective development, fishing and building. You notice the stone buildings. In Cape Verde, because these are volcanic islands, and so it's not a lot of wood, and so you've got this drought. So he was always looking at the environment. And then he goes and he studies what? Agronomy. The soil, the nature of the soil. and how you deal with crops. Okay, jump to your question. I think the implications are obvious. We live on planet Earth, and we have a very strong macro development of where we might go. Unfortunately, we don't have enough of these macro expressions, and it is in Bolivia, where Evo Morales, the first indigenous president in the Americas, and his social base that brought him to power, talk about Mother Earth. They see themselves as subservient to Mother Earth. There's a ministry of nature. It is a horizontal perspective. It's not just another vertical ministry. Everything relates to that. So we have some implications, just to go to have it touch in some ways on some of the fundamental perspectives of Cabral. I think this is something that we can draw on. I don't know of texts that I'm not a student of Cabral, so I'm not here as a Cabral expert. I'm just a general reader. But you might find a more in-depth text on climate or something of that sort. But certainly, that was a fundamental aspect, because it's the only way that the people could survive. It was not, oh, let's build factories and da-da-da, and then talk about the environment. The environment was a sine qua non. We cannot do anything unless we wrestle with this very tough climate that we are living in.
Yes, thank you very much for this enlightening discussion, and also Africa Now Project for presenting this film. I had a question about Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral. I see a lot of similarities in their theories, but I guess there are also differences, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the similarities and the differences in their theories, particularly in the question of culture, in which Fanon talked about the pitfalls of national culture, whereas Amilcar Cabral says to live your culture in an oppressed society is itself a revolutionary act. So if you could maybe talk about the concepts of both theorists.
I am neither a Frantz Fanon expert, and this is a commemorative year of Frantz Fanon. I can't recall what is, but look up Mireille Fanon, M-I-E-R-I-E-L-L-E, Ferré Fanon. She is the daughter of Frantz Fanon. She works with the UN in a civilian way, dealing with diaspora issues. She's based in Paris, but she spends a lot of time here in the Americas, particularly in South America, organizing with people, with black communities in Colombia and in Venezuela and other places. So look him up. A very important question, though, I think, because I think, again, culture was a fulcrum. It was central to the overall philosophical thinking and practical work of both of them. And one thing that they were very, very keen about, that many people in the black world, both here in the United States and in Europe and in Africa, tend to do in reacting to the absoluteness of white supremacy and colonialism and imperialism, in which white supremacy really emerges as the rationale for the development of capitalism and the rationalization of exploiting the minds and the bodies of these enslaved Africans on the continent. So it's really a neatly bunched unfolding when we put them all back together, right? But we tend to look at them separately. And so there is a tendency to say that all things European are white, and therefore I'm not going to deal with it. And then there's Africa, and there's never been Africa. 33 ethnic groups in Guinea. Languages are indicators of different ways of knowing and doing about the same thing. We all have to reproduce, we have to eat, and we have to have shelter, and we have to produce in some kind of way to get the products that we want. The different ways in which we do it is what culture is about. So the Inuit in Alaska will, of course, have 19 or whatever it is, 9, 10, 12 different words for snow. because the qualitative distinctions are very oppressive when they're falling during the winter season there. And down here we can talk about snow, sleet, and rain because it's quite less. But it's the same phenomena, but we have different terminologies because we have different contextual engagements. The context of our lives are different. The point being with Fanon and Cabral is they both looked very honestly, very hard, and both were very hard on superstitions, issues of superstition, because that's mystery. It means that you can't figure out how to deal with it, so you get off into religion. The implications would be with gender. The largest Christian denomination in the United States, I still think, holds the proposition that a woman's place is at home, raising children, caring for the domain of her man. And these are very sophisticated lawyers and doctors and nuclear physicists, not just bus drivers or rednecks running around talking about this. And a number of them are black, saying that to be gay or transgendered is a sin against God and all of. Fanon and Cabral would say, that's BS. Leave that behind. Don't uphold it simply because it's African. The question is, does it help you improve the quality of your material life and your ethical life? My term, that is the social relations of how people get along. So coming through the Black Power period, the Civil Rights period, you know, we had our queens. This is my queen. I'm the warrior queen. You stay home, have these babies. And I need to have 3 or 4 queens, in fact, while I go out here and do the organizing. I see some of y'all nodding your heads because, right, you know what I'm talking about. Because we were saying, well, you know, that's African. Or we were saying, I come from kings and queens, and I said, you know, wherever they were kings and queens, there were slaves and serfs, and so, you know, but that was our absolutist response to the absolutist nature of white supremacy. So I'm being speculatively analytical here. I don't have a document that I can point to, but yes, I think that both Fanon and Cabral had that in common, of trying to look reality as closely in the eye as possible and saying, this is good for human development, this is bad, and I don't care whether it was done by white people, green people, or black people, I'm going to bring my story to it.
There is an article that looks at Fanon and Cabral, and we can probably get that to you specifically, and they look at how they intersect but also how they differ. We have about...
and we need to reread Fanon.
Right.
Just as Cabral is not really appreciated, these guys had huge visions and energy about humanity, but coming from the perspective of being black and then moving horizontally out into the world. So that is another one. Those of you who are dealing with students and young minds, we really need to hold up Fanon as well and go back and do those readings. And those books are fairly accessible.
I wanted to do something that hopefully we'll be able to get. I think we have 2 last questions. We don't have that much time. If we want to take the 2 last questions, and then we want to have some closing remarks to this particular session. So if we can make your question a little bit short as possible, so we can try to find the continuities in it.
Absolutely. I do have a question. It was a comment to the previous one about the question between Black Lives Matter and environmental justice. As someone who's done work with those sisters, one, I don't dare speak for black women, but for as I understand our journey, Katrina is that environmental justice very similar to Cabral, and very similar to Cabral. And very similar to Cabral and the experience with the famine, I think it is Black Death that sparked him to become the revolutionary he was. Very similar to the level of state violence, and they understand state violence as what happened with Katrina, and that environmental justice is an anti-imperialist issue if we understand it. And so then my question is then for you to offer maybe an assessment of the Black Lives Movement. As if you were to put on your Cabral, Kufi, or thinking cap and offer an assessment.
That's a great question. That's a great question. Yes, and we're going to try to keep it as short as possible. Sorry.
So my question, thank you, James, for coming.
My question is, with the passing of Julian Bond, and when we think back to the civil rights movement, the shorter time it was, not that long.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter @AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Mwiza Mutali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, and technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC 90.5, a broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Until next week, be peaceful, be safe, and above all, be intelligent.